Welcome to the Why God Why podcast. My name is Peter Englert. I'm one of the co-hosts of this show. I'm here with our remarkable intern producer, Perrin. We're so glad to have her, and our illustrious co-host, Aaron Mercer. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Peter. Thanks for that introduction. And we're glad we have Perrin with us right now. She's a fellow Cedarville.
We're gonna kind of dismiss that for a little bit. So we are here today with author and pastor Don Everts. He wrote a book that we actually have. It's from Barna. It's called Discovering Your Gifts. He is responding to the question, why am I gifted the way that I am? And, you know, there's many of you listeners that are part of Browncroft, and you know that one of our spiritual habits is know and use your gifts. And for others of you, you know, you might be wondering, why is this topic important? And I think that whether you use the language of spiritual gifts or abilities or experience, we want to know what we're wired for. And I think Don's going to bring some great value, not just biblically, but also through analyzing some of the studies he's done through Barna. So can't wait to get into it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a
great conversation, and definitely something that is
close to a lot of people's hearts, you know. I love even the title, Discover Your Gifts, but the subtitle there, Celebrating How God Made You and Everyone You Know. You know, that's near and dear to our hearts, and I think this is it's a good one for us to be talking about. Thanks. Yeah, but so as we get started, I think, Don, I'd love for you to have an opportunity just to introduce yourself to the people who are listening on the podcast here or watching on YouTube, and would love to know a little bit about your journey. How did this become something of interest to you, and how did you get to the point where you're writing a book about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I'm someone, great to be with you guys. I'm excited to think about this alongside you guys. So, you know, I'm someone who, I grew up a nomad, moving every couple years, and I grew up yawning in church. As soon as I was old enough to, my parents said, "You don't have to go." I said, "Thank you very much." And then I had an encounter with Jesus, you know, at a Young Life camp in high school on accident, unintended. I was going to the camp to meet girls and met Jesus and kind of never recovered from that. And so my life has been, you know, not just a life of, you know, chasing after Jesus and, you know, fellowship with him and trying to follow him and asking him questions and all that, but trying to help other people encounter him too. So 14 years I did that on campus as a campus pastor, and I've been doing it 15 years now in the church context. And so, you know, along the way, you know, this topic of gifts and giftedness and God wanting to use us, it's a part of my own story. So that's part of the answer to your question of, you know, I grew up pretty poor and with pretty small horizons, but in following Jesus, the way he looked at me, you know, and the love that he has, it makes you see yourself differently and think, well, maybe God wants to use me in life. And so that's a part of my own story, is kind of learning how to see myself, how God sees me. And then in campus ministry, I was with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and there's a real emphasis on training student leaders. And so there's this real emphasis on helping people like discover their gifts and try using those gifts and experiment with them and try different things. And so it's been a part of my own experience and my experience with other people. And then you mentioned this research project with Barna. I got to be a part of this research project, and it like sobered me and shocked me and surprised me and gave me hope. But it kind of led to deeper thinking about, how has God made all of us? And does that matter? And how do we discover that?
Don, when you did that student ministry for all those years with InterVarsity, I'm curious, so and how often, I mean, you got to see different students come through every year, if not every 4 years. And you know, how often did that question come up of, what am I really gifted in? What is, you know, what do I have to offer? Is that, I'm sure that's probably something you heard often.
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways endemic to the college situation, because people are trying to figure out, who am I? What am I going to be? And, you know, what am I going to do? And so it's a great time of life in terms of the faith to allow God to speak into those questions as well, if that makes sense. And to, you know, how has God gifted me, and how do I, what's my calling in life? So not just to think about Yeah. So, folks in their late teens and early 20s, they're pretty aggressively asking those questions. I mean, some people are like, I just want to get a degree and a job and be comfortable. But most people, there's this like, who am I? And how's God made me? And how am I different than my parents? And a lot of experimenting. And we just encourage that, with students, like try everything, and unfortunately, I think some of us lose that.
Don, help me understand this. If you were to go back to 22-year-old Don, knowing what you know now about discovering gifts, what would you tell Don? And help our listeners and viewers kind of understand like your personal journey, because it seemed like there was more there that'd be really helpful for our listeners.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things I would say to 22-year-old me. But relative to this topic, part of it would be try everything. And I actually did have some good mentors who tried teaching, try leading worship, try doing mission trips, try, all that sort of stuff. So I would have said that. I think a piece of advice I would have given myself that I didn't get at the time would have been, don't just think about spiritual gifts, but think more broadly about even the common gifts that God has given you. Because there is such a focus, and in some ways rightly so, on spiritual gifts, and those are important. And Paul said, when it comes to spiritual gifts, I don't want you to be uninformed, right? Like, it's important that we understand these enablements that the Holy Spirit gives us for ministry. But there was such an emphasis on that I wasn't thinking about just some of the common gifts that God had given me when he created me. Does that make sense? And so I think I had a pretty narrow view of gifts and a pretty narrow view of vocation. And I would say to 22-year-old me, like, accept the Bible's a little bit fuller, a little bit broader vision of how God shapes people and the passions and the dispositions and the aptitudes that he gives them, even outside of spiritual gifts.
So, Don, I want to kind of land there because I think that that's super important. I think it's a lot of what you've dealt with in the book too, is like, so there's 3 main passages in the Bible about spiritual gifts. And then you mentioned common gifts. Is there a clear delineation? Is there more gray area? Like, so if someone's asking you, what's the difference between spiritual and common gifts? How do you walk someone through so that they still have the importance of the spiritual gifts in the Bible, but also don't miss the common gifts that God's given them?
Yeah. It's kind of 2 places where God is gracious and generous. So the Bible tells us that when God creates humans, he makes them, they are beautifully and fearfully knit together by God. And there's this common grace that God gives to everyone he creates. And he doesn't make bad things, right? The Bible is very clear that God as creator, makes people wonderfully. And he imparts gifts to them for them to use in life. And that doesn't matter if people recognize that comes from God. It doesn't matter if they're Christians. Like, that is a generosity of God as creator. And then there's this generosity through the Holy Spirit that those who come to faith in Jesus and have the Holy Spirit, God imparts special enablements through the Holy Spirit for ministry. And that's also just the generosity of God. We don't do anything to earn those either. And so it's important that, so the difference is believers receive spiritual gifts, but every human receives common. So common in the sense that they're common to all. It's a part of God's common grace to his creation that he makes all of us with aptitudes and abilities and skills and passions. Even non-believers, he's generous and he gives them those, even though they don't know they may not recognize where they come from. And so that's what I would say to someone is it's important to recognize both, because I'll be honest with you. I think I had, I was in a place where I was just focusing on spiritual gifts. But the reality is, like, God had given me common gifts as a communicator and as a writer and as a shaper of words. But that was not something that was named or celebrated in my worshiping community. In fact, I felt guilty that I took such joy in writing books for God. I think it wasn't until I wrote my third book that I stopped feeling guilty about writing books, because it wasn't like writing isn't in any of those three lists that you mentioned. Does that make sense? It's not one of those, and it's kind of a solitary act. And so I felt weird about it. And then it's the full biblical view that helped me realize God shaped me how he shaped me. And so I want to use even the common gifts, the ability, like communication gifts. God gave me communication gifts, and I can use those in the different callings that he gives me in life. And so that's a broader view that doesn't say that spiritual gifts are unimportant, but rather God's been more generous than just that. He has also given us creational gifts. And, I've talked with a lot of believers. One of the things we found in the research was that when pastors are talking about giftedness, most of the time they're talking about spiritual gifts, and that they don't talk about gifts in other ways. And I think we're missing out on part of the biblical witness when we do that.
So I'm glad you brought up the research, because I wanted to get into. Peter knows that I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to data research. So I think it's important. But so I'm curious about that. Like, could you just give us for this book, the Discover Your Gifts book, and I know it came out of some research with Barna. What can you give us some of the top line data that you based your work on the book for? And also, I'd love to know, is there something that, as you were doing the research, you just mentioned one data point there about what pastors tend to speak about. Was there something that surprised you that kind of changed the trajectory of how you had to do this book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Do you have 3 hours? Yeah. So some of the high level points, Aaron, are that pastors, this sub-study we did on pastors. So that was one of the findings that was kind of sobering, that we don't talk about giftings a lot. And most pastors admit that they believe it's important that people use their God-given gifts, but that they don't have a systematized or orderly way for actually encouraging that in their church. And so it's a really important thing. Like, pastors feel it's important, but they haven't invested in and it sounds like your church, you actually talk about it. It's like a high level thing for you all. And that's not common. So that was one finding. There were some sobering findings related to how people discover their gifts and have their gifts developed differently. So men on average are more in touch with their giftedness than women, not by a lot, but by enough that it's statistically significant. Younger people are much more interested and passionate in discovering their gifts, learning more about how they are made than older people. So there are some generational differences that came up, which, to be honest with you, I think really highlights an area of opportunity for the church. I mean, most churches, how do we engage with, younger generations? And it turns out they're really interested in learning about themselves and about how they're shaped. In fact, a lot of even non-Christians in the study said that they would be willing to go to a church to learn more about their gifts, if a church was, helping in that area. One of the sadder findings, which again but it's important data. One of the first questions was how gifted would you say you are on a scale of 0 to 10? And 3.5% of all respondents, and the way they do the research, that tells us that nationwide, about 3% of the adult population put 0. So 3.5% of the people out there don't feel that they are gifted in any way at all. Now that's sad, but the interesting thing the nerds at Barna did is they went back and they cut the data to say, is there anything these 3.5% of people have in common? These no gift people, and I put it in quotation marks because they actually do have gifts. The Bible tells us that, but they don't perceive that they do. And one of the things that they found was that these people in general are less connected and have less community in their life and go to church less and are less involved in their neighborhood and know fewer of their neighbors than other people. So there's some kind of interesting correlation between people who are so cut off from others that they don't think they have any giftedness at all. And think about what that would do to someone's soul to believe that or to think that. And then I think it underscores the importance, like often we discover our gifts in community because other people go, hey, you know, you're really good at this. You know, or, hey, you should try this. So those are some of the top level findings that we found.
Was this a one-time study, or have there been? So I guess where I'm going is I'm curious: has that 3% number grown or decreased over time? Is it? I don't know if there was some sort of a repetitive study here.
No, it's not longitudinal. So it was just a slice in time. You know, but it was, you know, accounted for regionally, you know, across people's financial spectrum, et cetera, et cetera. So it's nationwide verified research, but we just did a slice in time. Yeah. So
before we started airing, you mentioned this question that you wish more people asked you, and I'm going to kind of answer it a little bit. Then I want to get in the question you wish more people asked you was, why don't pastors like talk about this? Because the picture you're painting, even for our listeners, is like, if you would talk about spiritual gifts, like you would be surprised who shows up. If you just talked about common gifts, you'd be surprised who shows up. And hopefully I'm getting that question right. But, you know, as a pastor, I think what I find complicated, so Don and I have something in common. We're, you know, he lives in Springfield, Missouri. I lived in Springfield, Missouri. I grew up Assemblies of God, which is Pentecostal. They have a little bit of a different view on, you know, spiritual gifts, especially speaking in other tongues. And it gets complicated trying to explain to people, you know, if you take a spiritual gifts test, and we can kind of get into that, I have the gift of speaking in tongues. And it's like, well, you know, there's a lot of theology wrapped up, even the gift of prophecy. And then with prophecy, there's, you know, forthtelling and foretelling. So what we mean by that is I can be prophetic and just speak truth, but I can also be prophetic and actually say, hey, God's going to do this in your life. And, you know, one of the things that I appreciated about the Assemblies of God was they were the first ones to help you recognize that people that have spiritual gifts are still imperfect people that use them wrong. So I think that was one of the healthiest things I learned. But coming back to this question of why pastors don't talk about it, my answer would be it's really complicated, in the sense of like, it doesn't necessarily need to be complicated, but to try to help someone, even with something as straightforward as faith, is it just because you're positive, or is it, so that's going to, I don't know, you take all of that jumble, respond to it. Love to hear more of your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, it is complicated. Spiritual gifts are complicated and common gifts are complicated. I would say that's the reason, that's one of the reasons that pastors don't invest more in helping people discover their gifts and grow their gifts and deploy their gifts. So spiritual gifts can be complicated for the way that you mentioned. I mean, theologically, and I mean, there can be all sorts of complications for that. But I think across the board, one of the complications is that it's messy to help people discover their gifts and start using them. And I think for some, and I'm pointing my finger at me here as a pastor, okay, that it's cleaner to have professionals or practitioners who use their gifts, and that people come into the church to consume what they're offering. And obviously that's like a very sub-biblical picture of church, but it is neat and it is orderly. And unfortunately, it can stroke the ego of said professionals. You know, people come here, I'm the sage on the stage, and, you know, all that sort of thing. So there's something humbling. There's something messy. There's something relational about investing in equipping the saints, as Paul would put it, equipping the saints to use their gifts. And as you mentioned, everyone who uses a gift is imperfect, right? And there's character involved, and there's like coaching, and there's all sorts of things that come up, and risk taking, and praying for someone, like, you can do this. My son recently started doing the slides, for our church, and he was so nervous, and like, I'm like, listen, you're very orderly, like you feel comfortable around technology, you can do this. You see, that coaching, that like relational stuff, that takes time. And it takes, investment in people. And so I think in some ways it can be easier at times to just have the professionals use their gifts and have everyone else kind of be more of a consumer. I think that's some of why pastors don't invest time. And maybe they're just so busy doing other things, But I just find, the image very compelling, from Ephesians, that God has, given apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for ministry. Like, the reason he gives these kind of 5 types of leaders, according to Paul, God is generous with giving leaders to the church so that the leaders will equip the saints for ministry. And that is messy and sometimes thankless and humble and behind the scenes work. And I myself, since doing the research and reflecting on my own story, have been more and more convicted that needs to take up a higher percentage of the time of what I do as a pastor.
So before you go, Aaron, because this idea, I think, to our listeners is going to be pretty new, common versus spiritual gifts. So let me take leadership. There are great leaders that don't go to church, that write great books.
Yeah.
And leadership could probably be a common gift. But in your mind, when does leadership move, and you could do this with most all the gifts, when does it move from a common gift to a spiritual gift?
Oh, that's an interesting question, Peter. I think maybe what I would say is it's more of an overlay. So in other words, I believe that one of the common gifts that God gives people are leadership gifts, the ability to move people. And as you say, there are non-believers, there are Buddhists, there's all sorts of people that God has given leadership gifts to, and they use those. But then if you overlay those common gifts with, for example, a gift in being an apostle, or a gift of being a shepherding gift, or a teaching gift, I think it just like multiplies and fills out and makes more robust that common gift. And so so that's why I would say that there are leaders, right? Or there are layers to it. And for us as believers, like, God has been doubly generous with us. We have common gifts, and he's giving us spiritual gifts on top of that. And so our gift IQ, it doesn't hurt if our gift IQ goes up a little bit. In other words, we're discovering more about how God has gifted us. Because I believe that the Bible's message is God gives us gifts so that we will use them. I know that's a radical concept, but you can't use them if you aren't discovering them and knowing that you have them. Does that make sense? So I think it's like layers, and beautiful layers of ways that, God gives people, say a common gift is like relational skills or multicultural skills, and then to layer those with gifts within the Spirit can be super powerful within the church.
That's I think jumping off from there, I appreciate that, and I wanted to turn the conversation a little bit to, actually, I would love to, maybe it'd be great to hear what are some of the strategies you use to get people to know what their gifts are. I don't know if you have them go through classes or take a test or whatever, or just, I think you did mention, just go and do stuff and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
But where is there a need? Go jump in. But I wanted to ask about on the other side of that, there are people. You mentioned the 3.5% who feel like they don't have any gifts, and that's sad and also very that would be really hard, like people feeling that isolated. But I imagine, I don't know what the percentages are. Maybe there was data in your research on this of people who probably have an inkling that they have a gift, but maybe kind of discount that they could use it for anything, or that it's good enough of a gift. Like, how do you get to those people? And when I say those people, I feel like I could probably, depending on the circumstance, could be in that, might think that I have a gift in something, but I'm not ready to jump into it. Like, how do you get people to the point where they should take action, experiment with that gift? What do you do to kind of lead people that way? And why do you think they do that in the first place? And then how do you help them?
Well, you added in a very layered question at the end. I think there's a wide variety of things just in our biographies and in the stories of our life that lead people to see themselves as not a gift with gifts to share. So there's a wide variety of things that I think that lead people there. Poverty is one of those. There's lots of different ones. But I think some really practical things that we can do to help people see their gifts are to talk about a wider range of gifts. One of the problems of being a pastor, and maybe Peter can relate with this, is when you are telling stories from your life, there's stories about a pastor because you are one, right? And so it can be a pretty narrow, like there's stories about evangelism and stories about discipling people and stories about, teaching or whatever. And I think we can really help people by in the examples that we give, using a broader range of gift types so that people can see themselves in what we're talking about and go, oh, that's a gift like that. I just naturally do that, but you're celebrating that. You're saying that's like a really cool, worthwhile thing to be doing. So I think in our storytelling, in our testimonies, in the examples that we give, I'm a firm believer in lifting up humble people who are serving behind the scenes. And I think like whether to their face or in a group of people or even from up front, to lift up people who are using the gifts that are maybe less visible or less celebrated in my stream of the church, because there are certain gifts that are really celebrated in my stream of the church. And all the other gifts are second-class gifts. Does that make sense? And that probably varies from church to church or denomination to denomination. But I think we could do a better job of celebrating a broader range. And then I personally have just taken it upon myself in researching for this book. I talked with someone who grew up in a church, and he said, my pastor was constantly going up to people and saying, I think you may have a gift in this. I think you should try that. He was just going up to everyone. And he said, I grew up in a church where everyone got to play. That's how he put it. Isn't that an attractive image where you would think everyone gets to play? Everyone here has a gift. And so the more we can try to create that culture, I think the more people who, for whatever reason in their own history, doubt it about themselves, I think it can kind of pull them out and they can kind of get caught up. Well, I'll give you an example of something we're trying, because I think the relational thing is important. Examples are important, but also then trying to create some kinds of systems or like framework to help people be doing that as well. So the results aren't in yet, but we're trying something at our church. We created what we call the gift exchange. And there's two sides to it. It's like a literal bulletin board, stand-up bulletin board. And on one side, or ministries in the church are saying, hey, we're looking for people with these kind of gifts to help with this kind of stuff. And then on the other side is where people fill out their own thing and say, I have these kinds of gifts. And they put them up. And so we're encouraging people, like, go look at the gifts we're looking for. And leaders in the church, you go look, rather than asking the people who always say yes and you're used to asking to do things, go look at what people put up and give them a call. And so it's an interesting, rather than like we're looking for volunteers, or rather than like, we have a sign-up list. We're narrating the whole thing through the language of gifts. It's a gift exchange, and we're looking for gifts, and you're offering gifts, and I'm really writing our leaders, like new people who haven't been using their gifts or in leadership positions. I want you to go look and see what they're saying and give them a call. So that's a little thing we're trying to do to kind of re-narrate our culture in such a way that it's like everyone has gifts, and you have gifts. And so how does God maybe want you to use them? So those are a few examples.
I really appreciate that because not all of our listeners get to have coffee with me, but I think one of my favorite parts of having coffee or lunch with someone is just to find out what they're passionate about. And sometimes that wording is helpful because if I say I'm gifted, but
right.
So a few weeks ago, I'm having coffee with a gentleman. He's been working 36 years as a technician at a plant, and he begins talking a language that I had no idea how to respond. And he's teaching me, he's like, when I go into this, certain area and we have to make sure we fix these fabricators, and he's using all this language. And I had some fun with him because I need to do some work on our garage, and I was just asking him dumb cement questions. And he's like, if you want to fill cement holes, you have to clean it all out, make sure that it's dry. And, so he asked the question, he's like, hey, how can I use my experience instead of gifts? And I'd call it gifts in him.
Sure.
How can I use my experience at the church? And, we have this partnership in Senegal with the Wolof people. And I'm like, Lou, you got to go to Senegal, to teach and train. And I use that story as a specific example because it's not the ones that I would share personally, but I would tell our listeners, whether you go to Browncroft or not, I'd love to have coffee with you, or if you go to a different church, you would be surprised at saying, hey, this is what I'm good at, and that there might be a deeper connection to that.
Yeah. And often, you're right, Peter, often passion is a nice window that people can look through as well to get a sense of, well, I'm passionate about kids, or I'm passionate about, this, that, or the other. And often, I've experienced this myself. If we're gifted in something, we sometimes overlook that because we assume, well, that's easy and it must be easy for everyone. Because we assume everyone thinks and feels the way we do, which is, just a normal self-centered way to view the universe. But so there's something too that's part of what can be helpful about an inventory, or sitting down with coffee with someone else who can reflect, hey, I see this in you, or taking an inventory. And we developed a whole inventory on common gifts based on the research. Part of what's helpful about that is it can help shine a light on things that we as people will just overlook, because I just, I assume, taking complex problems and summarizing it in a really simple way, I assume everyone can do that. Well, it turns out that's not the case, or my wife, who is total relational gifts. She can get into a conversation with anyone. Well, that's natural for her, but she doesn't know, that's really hard for, other people can't talk to strangers like you do. So things like that, I think, can help people look at things about themselves and recognize, oh, that's not easy for everyone. Maybe I have a gift there. And the importance of discovering the gifts is then saying, okay, how does God want to use that? Whether that's in my household, in my job, in my neighborhood, or yes, even in the church. But, God gives us these gifts so that we will generously use them.
So I want to come back to your story. And you touch on a little bit of this in the book, you share personally, but, help our listeners understand, the 24-year-old Don, you gave advice, but what was it that helped you kind of figure out kind of your gifts, and, what were the specific experiences? What were the specific mentors and things that they said? If you feel comfortable, you can even share what those gifts are. Someone saw you do this or do that. I think that'd be helpful for our audience.
Yeah. So for me, again, I had leaders who said, try everything. And so, at the end of my freshman year of college, someone came up and said, I've really enjoyed your presence in Bible study, and I'd like to, it seems like you have a kind of a passion for the Bible. I'd like to invite you to be a Bible study leader, and we'd give you a partner, and we would give you training and coach you in doing it. And I was a very reticent leader. I'll be really honest with you guys. Like my dream was to like live in a cabin in the woods by myself. I mean, that's really all I wanted in life. I'm like, why would I choose to be around more people? But I did it. So there was like that initial invitation combined with them saying, we will help you. We'll give you a partner and we're going to give you coaching. And so it was that, like the furnace of that next year of weekly using gifts in organizing, in inviting people, in studying the Bible ahead of time and preparing things, in evaluating things afterwards, in thinking strategically about discipling people in the Bible study, in planning parties. And like, I wasn't equally good at all those things, you know what I mean? But then partnering with others. And so like just that one invitation for a 9-month period, that's all it was. It was for just a school year. It was like, I think I have gifts in teaching. And I think I have gifts in service. Like I love serving behind the scenes. And I have a big hole when it comes to some of the relational gifts. Like I need help. I need help there. And in throwing parties and stuff like that. So it was like a safe place to explore strengths, but also weaknesses. And then it kind of went on from there. InterVarsity is a great culture at developing people. And so, you know, there was a time, hey, Don, how would you like to learn how to play guitar and help us in worship? Hey, Don, how would you like to do the slides? Hey, Don, how would you like to lead a trip to another country and lead a team? So all those invitations, every single one of them made me pee my pants and be like, oh, no, you know, like it was scary. It was scary and risky. But by saying yes and exploring things, I mean, God can use even our efforts, whether we're using our gifts or not. That's another generosity of God's. But it helped me kind of find this way that, I mean, the weird thing is, rather than live in a cabin in the woods, I've lived my life doing aerobically relational ministry. So, you know, and with a real appreciation of where I need help and my blind sides and where I don't have gifts. And so anywhere I go now, I'm a senior pastor now. Here's the kind of people I need on my team because those are gifts I don't have. And we need to partner with each other. So that's some examples of real simple, like, hey, you should try this. And hey, let me do coaching. You know, coaching and mentoring are such huge gifts that we don't always get to experience. You know, volunteering is sort of like, if you sign this piece of paper, then come do the thing. And then, you know, maybe we'll give you, you know, thanks at the end. But being mentored, being coached, having your gifts developed and nurtured by others, that's a different game. And that was a game changer for me.
I love that you brought up there that you found out both what your gifts, your strengths were, as well as your weaknesses, areas where you had holes in gifts. Because that was actually something that was on my mind was, you know, how do you help people realize maybe a place where they need a little extra help, or they're not, you know, everybody wants to be able to dunk the basketball, but not everybody can. You know, I think that's interesting. But I loved how you framed it as, say yes, you know, say yes and find out. No, I like that a lot. And, you know, it made me wonder, like, well, you mentioned it's helped you as you've been growing in church leadership, that you've been able to say, okay, well, what other people do I need on my team? You know, I think that's a great realization. And obviously the more you can lead out of strength, that's helpful. But I also liked that you brought up, you know, God can still use you even if you're leading out of a weakness. I mean, His strength is made perfect in our weakness. And I guess I'd love to hear you dig into that a little bit more. And also, you know, do you think I know it's good for us to figure out what our strengths and weaknesses are, but have you found, or maybe the research even found, I don't know if it says anything to this, like, are we more likely to think that we are weaker in some areas than we actually are? Like, how do we overcome those? Is that a hurdle, and how do we overcome it? So that was a lot of questions all in one. You get to answer however you want.
I'll just choose one of them. Yeah. The research didn't get into as much areas of weakness, although it did get into development of gifts. And so there's some fascinating things in the research in terms of, where have you had your gifts developed and nurtured by others? So some of the interesting dynamics that we found there are men on average have expressed that more people have nurtured them in their gifts, that people who have higher education have had more people kind of help nurture them and coach them in their gifts. There are certain communities in the African American community, mentoring and coaching, there are high levels of that, they then say, in an Anglo or white culture. So it's interesting that there are different having gifts developed, which is kind of getting at, weakness and how do we grow in these things, that we experience that differently. And it's something to know, right? It's something to know and be conscious of as we're helping coach others and mentor others. And I think, I personally think, I was told by a professor who shall go nameless in seminary that take this inventory and it will tell you exactly what your gifts are. And so you'll never have to struggle through and just find jobs where you're just using those gifts. And maybe for some people that's the path for them, and God bless them, right? If there's a pain-free way and you're just going to use your gifts all the time. But I actually think more of my experience and what I've seen in others, and part of what leads to healthy, humble, non-narcissistic leadership is that we are operating out of weakness at times. And the kind of prayer and the kind of humility and the kind of having to ask for forgiveness of people, there's something about that I think is actually character forming in really important ways. And again, we follow, you look in the scriptures and it often seems that God calls unlikely people to do certain things. And so there's something about God like that. Again, this is another rabbit trail, but God wants the glory, right? And there's something about, like, he's made perfect in our weakness, right? His strength is made perfect, that glory goes to him if we are acknowledging our weaknesses, even as we're discovering our gifts, using our gifts. It's not a perfectly clean story, and we're going to mess up, and we have weaknesses. And I think that's just as important part of the fabric of our leadership or of our ministry or of our service or leading in our household as when we use our gifts. I think there's something important about that.
I want to give you a scenario based on what you just said, because I think that's helpful. And I'm going to throw myself under the bus, which Aaron always loves. So, so there's a spiritual gift of serving, and there's definitely like a common gift of serving. And then I'd add a third category, like we're all just supposed to serve.
That's
like,
right. That's right.
I don't care if you follow Jesus or not. Like, if you say, oh, no, I don't have the gift of serving. So, the other night I'm leading a group, and I had 10 minutes to print out the handouts, to get the videos all ready. And ironically, it was we were meeting around the ruthless elimination of hurry, which I was hurrying around to get done. And, it's funny, one of our teammates who's wonderful, Donna says to me, she's like, I can print that stuff out for you next week. And through this whole series, like, she's been printing stuff out and supporting me. And I think one of the complications are, like, there's times when you're serving in a role where you have to be like super focused. Like if I'm printing out the papers and I'm running around, even if I get in a half hour early, I don't have time to engage people. But you also don't want to dismiss the humility and value of, hey, like, there's times, like, I know I can name several individuals that when they're walking down the hallway and they see a piece of trash, they pick it up and they throw it out. You'd be surprised how much that doesn't happen. And so it's trying to kind of manage this, take a test, do your gifts and do that only, versus like there's things that we're all called to do, motivated by the gospel, but even society would say. So take all of that.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
I would say you're very emotionally mature, and that's like a real, like you're wrestling with it in a good way, because you're right. Service is a spiritual gift. It's also a common gift, and then it's also a virtue commanded by our King, right? And so I think the way to navigate that is proportion, right? And over the long haul, like if you look back at, say, a 3-month period, and you haven't done much humble service, maybe that's when you go, okay, I'm in a little bit of a danger zone, and I need to lay my life down in some uncomfortable ways just to have moral authority, and just to be like my King, who he himself washed feet. I think to evaluate, because I think the danger is if you go a long time without that. But the reality is, and I experienced this too, Peter, that there are people who, like, I want to be helpful, and they like watch me, and they're like, hey, can I get that for you? And I was like, well, I can do that. I'm not above doing that, but they're looking for ways that they can plug in, and that it's kind of an honor to be able to do that. And so I don't want to rob people of that, but I also don't want to get close to this cliff that some leaders get close to, where they feel they're above certain things. And if Jesus was not above washing people's feet, then neither are we. And I remember I went and spoke at this week-long conference. I think I gave like 8 talks, and I was like the sage on the stage, all that sort of thing. And then afterwards, the campers were leaving, and I went, and there was this backed up toilet. And I just thought, I'm going to fix that. I'm going to get down on my knees and fix this nasty toilet. And no one saw me doing it. Yeah, I guess I'm telling you now, but statutes of limitations, it was like 30 years ago. But there's something right about doing that because I'm a believer in Jesus and I follow Jesus. And there's something right about saying, I'm not going to go live in a cabin in the woods because God's given me communication gifts. And so, yes, I'll come speak at your conference. Does that make sense? So it's like, I want to be using my gifts, and I want to be doing other things, like, say, evangelism. There are a lot of people who have gifts, spiritual gift of evangelism. But all of us, all believers, are called to be witnesses, whether you got the gift or not. And so, yeah, that's a balance. It's a balance. That's a very perceptive question.
So one other thing, because one of our interns that we have this summer brought this up to me recently, and she said to me, I'd love for someone to talk a little bit about like the difference of being like called to ministry versus a vocation outside the church. And that's a whole nother episode, but I want you to kind of respond to that in gifts, because like, even you've hinted at this, like in the church, my parents grew up Catholic, so I feel like I have credibility to say this, like the penultimate, for Catholicism in Endicott, New York in 1965 was one of your children becomes a priest. And
Totally.
Protestants have even taken that. So how would you talk to someone that like there's this proclivity to, if I really want to make a difference, I need to work for a church, or I need to work for a nonprofit? How do you walk someone through the discernment, but also just kind of helping them value their gifts if that's not where God's calling them?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things the research revealed is that pastors and churches celebrate people using their gifts in the church. And when you ask the same question, do you celebrate people using their gifts outside of the church, the numbers drop. And so it's an honest problem. And it is not unlike what Luther confronted at the beginning of the Reformation, where it was a 2-class system, where you have the vocations, is what they called them, priest, nun, monk, and then everyone else, like, well, yeah, we need someone to milk the cow, but spiritually it's second class. And Luther, so what I've found helpful as we've been in the research, and it's pushed me back into church history and back into the scriptures, Luther's take on vocation was you have multiple vocations. And vocations are every role and responsibility that God calls you to. So in other words, I have a vocation as a father because I have kids. I have a vocation as a husband because I have a wife. That's a role in a relationship. I have a vocation as a neighbor because I live somewhere and I have neighbors, and God has thoughts about that. I have a vocation in my job, whatever job I'm working. And for believers, I have a vocation in the church. So I actually find Luther's rubric really, really helpful because it takes us away from, well, you have one vocation. Is it in the church or is it not in the church? And it says, all of us have a vocation in the church, actually. All of us have a vocation in our household. And all of us have a vocation in our community. And all of us have a vocation in our work, if you will. And how do you be faithful with those? And how do you use your gift in those different ones? And so I find that to be a really helpful rubric to then have someone ask the question, am I called to have my paying job be in the church? Because it's a much more nuanced framework to ask it from, rather than just this binary, well, you could be one of the elite who has a vocation in the church, or you could make money and, we need people to milk the cows. So, you could do it, but God doesn't like it as much. It's not as important, that kind of binary place is a really fraught place for people to ask these really important questions about ministry. My son right now is asking questions about becoming a pastor. He's 22. You brought up 22. I have a 22-year-old kid now. And he's asking those questions. And so how do I navigate that with him in a way that, like, if God's calling you to do that, that's really important. And you have to pay attention to that. But to interact with him in such a way that I don't bias, like that's the only valid thing or the most valid thing you could do as a Christian. So there is an honest bias in the church, even the Protestant church. The research shows it. And so I think we need to name that bias and try to get more biblical in our understanding of vocations. We're all gifted and we're all called. And that's what vocation means, is called. That's the vocare. That's what it means, is called. We're all called to use those gifts in the different areas of our life. So I try to shift the conversation in those places, because if someone's like, well, or should I be a pastor or an engineer? It's like, even if God calls you to be an engineer, you have a vocation in the church. So you're going to have to navigate that regardless. And even if God calls you to be in the church, you have a vocation as a neighbor. So I have found that stream of vocational theology and those scriptures that inform that to be really helpful.
As we kind of come to a close, this episode, we interviewed Derek Sherman, who actually does a whole episode on why can I be an engineer and a Christian at the same time. So I think it's brilliant. So this all works out. Before we recap to our last question, what I think I've heard you say is try new things. Assessments are okay, but they're not the silver bullet. Be in community to have people observe you, but also see gifts in others. To that 24-year-old, even to your 22-year-old son, after those three things, is there anything else you would say, or the research would say, of helping you find whether it's your spiritual or common gifts that you'd want to add?
That's great. I would say that it is a tip for people to find and always have a mentor or two. Always have a mentor or two in your life, whether they're in your specialty or not, if that makes sense. Like someone who doesn't have a vested interest in the success of your job or of what you're doing. Someone who can listen and see things in you. I think that's the other thing I would say, is just ask someone, hey, for the next season of my life, would you mentor me a little bit? Or would you, I'm growing in this. Would you help me do that? So it's like what you said, like be in relationships, but it's a kind of relationship that I think is in this area really, really important.
Well, that's a great place to close, but we ask one more question. And the great thing about asking pastors to come on is you can clean up whatever mess we leave. So we always ask, what does Jesus have to say about this topic? So what does Jesus have to say? Why am I gifted the way that I am? So Aaron and I are going to go first. You clean up our mess, and then we'll go from there. But
Cool.
Aaron, do you want to go first, or you want me to go first?
Sure. I think that, this is a really important conversation, and at Browncroft, one of the spiritual habits that we talk about is knowing and using your gifts, and I think that's really important to explore, and by saying yes and finding out where we have strength and weakness and whatnot. I also just love the conversation we just had too about sometimes you just have to act in your weakness too, and know that if Christ is calling us to something, whether it's something we think we're strong in or not, he's going to provide strength for that one way or another. So I think it's a really good conversation, and I think we should definitely be pursuing knowing these gifts more and more.
No, I appreciate that, Aaron. And, as Don was talking, I think one of the reasons I hope people read the Bible is to see the gifts and also the vocations that Luther talked about, of being a parent, being a father, or a parent and a spouse, or whatever role you play, but also like the literal careers. I think of Paul, for instance. Here's someone that makes tents, and he also serves the church. And, the Philippian church, Lydia was a dyer of purple. There was also the centurion. And as you read the Bible, you see a tapestry of people that matter. And, right now in our Bible reading plan, we're reading the book of Acts. And, people didn't get demoted to serve as deacons. They were empowered to serve as deacons because of their gifts. And they said, hey, we want to free up the apostles to do this. And when you read it, it has way more of a valuing in our culture than we even do. So I think what Jesus would say is, you're created in his image. You're created with gifts to bless and love other people, to love God for his, for his glory, but also to love your neighbor and make a difference. So that's how I'd close it.
Yeah, that's great. I think, Jesus, one of the striking things about Jesus was how he looked at people, how he saw people. And Jesus saw, that was part of what was radical about him, is that he saw everyone as possessing dignity and beauty. And, the widow at Nain, right? He was moved when he saw her, and he saw lepers that other people overlooked. So Jesus saw, I think, everyone as someone who was fearfully and wonderfully made. And he saw people as gifted, and he called them to use those gifts. So you think about, where most of us would have seen Peter and go, oh, I can't wait for him to graduate and move, or Simon, And Jesus saw him and went, I see leadership. God's given you leadership, and I want to call you into that. Or, the different people that Jesus called into ministry in some ways were unlikely, and yet he said, okay, here, come on. So I think Jesus is our model, right? And Jesus saw people as gifts, and then he saw them as having gifts to share, and he called them, to use those gifts. And, Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus is terrible. And Jesus not only I see you, I want to have dinner with you, but then okay, here's what it means to follow me. Inviting him to be a part of things, inviting him to play in the kingdom. And so in that sense, this topic is important because I think I want to be more like Jesus. And he kind of saw people a certain way, and that informed how he called them to be a part of what he was doing. And I want to be more like that.
Wow, what a great way to close. And just a reminder, we're thankful for Krista Clayton at IVP. If you go to the IVP website after this is aired for 2 weeks, you use the code YGOD, you can get Don's book and the workbook for 30% off. So I would really encourage you to check that out. And you can follow Don. Where's the best place for people to get a hold of you or follow you?
Yeah, I'm a terrible follow. I'm going to be really honest. for this topic, going to Lutheran Hour Ministries page that they sponsored the research, so lhm.org/gifted, and we've put lots of resources that we made to equip people to explore their gifts and all that sort of thing. I think would be the most fruitful place to go. I'm just an underperformer, woefully underperforming in social media.
It's all right. It's just not your gift.
I was going to say, everyone has gifts, right?
That's right.
It's all
That's
good.
right.
Well, oh, man. Well, thank you so much for joining us. The best way to get a hold of us is to go to whygodwhypodcast.com. You can click the subscribe link. You'll get this episode and many others emailed to you each Thursday. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Thanks. Good to be with you guys.